King Guy of Lusignan stands in a silk tent pitched on a scorched plateau, staring at a horizon that has become a ring of fire. Just hours ago, Guy sat in the safety of the springs at Sephoria, but a single, panicked decision to march across the waterless desert has turned his elite cavalry into a desperate mass. He realizes the true cross is about to become a war trophy. The choice was between the patience of a king and the impulsiveness of a gambler, and Guy has bet the entire kingdom of Jerusalem on a road that leads only to the abyss. Just weeks ago, the Crusaders believed they were an immovable force. They operated under the grand illusion that the local geography was merely a backdrop to their iron will, failing to respect the desert as a living enemy. This illusion of invincibility led them to believe they could dictate terms anywhere, ignoring that a knight in 80 pounds of steel is only as strong as the last drop of water he drank. The origin of the disaster lies in the aggressive behavior of Reynald of Chatillon, a rogue baron who treated the desert like his personal hunting ground. His decision to attack a massive Muslim caravan, violating a truce, was the spark that forced Saladin's hand. Reynald's thirst for plunder ensured that the sword would finally be turned against the very throat of Jerusalem. Guy of Lusignan's ego was his greatest general, but in the dry heat of Galilee, it became his executioner. Alongside him stood Reynald of Chatillon and Gerard de Rochefort, who viewed caution as heresy. On the other side was Saladin, the patient sultan, who understood that the desert was his most effective weapon. Saladin didn't need to break shields. He only needed to lure them away from their wells. Guy ignored the one thing he couldn't conquer, the physiological reality of heat stroke and thirst. The silent variable at Hattin was the temperature, which soared above 100 degrees. Saladin's light cavalry harassed the column, forcing them to stay in formation. By mid-afternoon, the knights weren't fighting Saracens. They were fighting their own bodies, cooking inside their mail shirts before an arrow was even fired. While nobles argued, the common foot soldiers were drinking the blood of their horses to stay conscious. The shadow narrative is one of total biological collapse. They could see the blue waters of the Sea of Galilee, but Saladin's army stood between them and salvation. The Crusader army was no longer a military unit. It was a dying organism, gasping for air in a landscape turned into a furnace. The plan was simple: march 10 miles to relieve Tiberias. The reality was a slaughterhouse. In the final war council, the Count of Tripoli pleaded to stay put, but the logistics of the war room were overruled by the politics of the coward label. Guy, fearing he would look weak, chose a path that required a march through a volcanic landscape with no water. The logistics were fundamentally broken from the first mile. On the afternoon of July 3rd, King Guy halted the march on a dry plateau rather than pushing for water, the moment the kingdom of Jerusalem died. This fatal hesitation allowed Saladin to surround them. Throughout the night, the Sultan's men poured camel loads of water onto the sand within earshot of the parched Crusaders. By dawn, they were so weakened they could barely lift their shields. Saladin calculated that Crusader pride would outweigh common sense. He knew the Franks were strangers to this land. His calculus included the psychological state of King Guy, a man desperate to prove his worth. Saladin didn't need a numerical advantage. He only needed to wait for the sun. This transformed the geography of Galilee into a giant, sun-powered trap that snapped shut the moment they left the shade. Raymond of Tripoli wanted to wait, Reynald wanted to kill, Guy surrendered his judgment to the loudest voice. This internal friction meant that when the march began, the leaders weren't even speaking to each other. The Crusader army marched as a house divided, with the king so crippled by indecision that he allowed the most radical elements to dictate the fate of 10,000 men. Official accounts spoke of martyrdom, but the discarded armor told the true story. The cleanup was a grim assembly line of execution and slavery. Saladin ordered the immediate execution of every Templar knight. For decades after, travelers in Galilee reported seeing the bleached white bones of the Crusader army littering the volcanic slopes, a skeletal reminder of the day the invincible army simply withered away. Modern forensic analysis reveals the efficiency of thirst as a weapon. Archaeologists found discarded helmets and shields, indicating men stripped off protection to cool their bodies. The review shows a fragmented and chaotic final stand. The science validates the historical accounts. The army didn't lose a battle, they lost a struggle against the environment. Imagine a knight carrying a relic of the true cross, realizing he can't pray for water when his throat is filled with dust. The human toll was the decapitation of the Crusader state. When the news reached Jerusalem, it was a wave of pure terror. The kingdom of heaven was suddenly a kingdom of widows. The dream of a permanent Christian East died that day, replaced by the cold reality that they were merely temporary guests. This single decision shattered the myth of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and triggered the Third Crusade. After Guy's gamble, the map of the Middle East was redrawn in weeks. Saladin swept through the coastal cities, taking Jerusalem and ending a century of Crusader rule. Hattin became the ultimate warning in military history that logistics and geography will always defeat zealotry and ego. If you were in that tent, would you have risked the march to save a city or let it burn to save your army? History judges Guy as a mad king, but he was caught between faith and environment. We all face our own Hattin, the moment we are pressured to ignore reality for an illusion. The question isn't just about tactical errors, it's about the courage to be cautious when everyone else is demanding blood. The bells of the Holy Sepulchre toll not for a victory, but as a funeral dirge for a kingdom. As the first sun-scorched survivors of Hattin stagger through the gates, the kingdom of heaven realizes its iron shield has been shattered. King Guy is a prisoner, the true cross is gone, and the city's defenders are reduced to old men, priests, and boys. In the center of this storm stands Balian of Ibelin, the final architect of Jerusalem's survival. Join the archive for the conclusion of this dark history. For 88 years, the Franks had ruled Jerusalem, transforming it into a western outpost in the heart of the East. It was more than just a capital. It was the psychological anchor of the Crusader world. Saladin didn't just want the city for its strategic value. He wanted to restore the Al-Aqsa Mosque to the Islamic world. For both sides, Jerusalem was the moral mirror of their faith, and its loss would be a scar on the soul of Christendom. Balian of Ibelin never asked to be a hero. He only wanted safe passage to rescue his family. But when he arrived, the people begged him to stay. Balian was a practical man, in a city blinded by zealotry. Facing him was Saladin, a leader who combined tactical brilliance with a deep sense of destiny. These two men would engage in a psychological duel where the stakes weren't just stone walls, but the lives of 60,000 people. Before the first arrow was fired at Jerusalem, Saladin's army moved like a scythe through the Levant. Acre, Jaffa, and Caesarea fell in rapid succession. Each city that surrendered was a message. The desert had already won. By the time Saladin's tents appeared on the Mount of Olives in September 1187, the city was a lonely island in a sea of Saracen steel. The inhabitants realized the invincible fortresses were now merely memories. The siege began with the thunder of mangonels. Saladin focused his fire on the northern walls. Balian, in a desperate move, knighted every boy over the age of 16 to bolster morale. For 2 weeks, the wall of shields held against the relentless barrage of stones and Greek fire. The fighting was a brutal struggle in the shadow of the Dome of the Rock, where the air was thick with sulfur and the screams of men fighting for a city they believed was theirs. As the walls began to crumble, Balian realized he had one card left, the holy leverage. He threatened Saladin that if the city were taken by force, the Crusaders would destroy every holy site, kill every Muslim captive, and then themselves, leaving nothing but a pile of rubble. This was the ultimate gamble, a threat to erase the very prize the Sultan fought for. It was a cold calculus that forced Saladin to choose between total victory and a negotiated peace. The siege ended not with a massacre, but with a ledger. Saladin agreed to let the inhabitants buy their freedom, 10 gold pieces for a man, 5 for a woman. Those who couldn't pay were doomed to slavery. The ransom of souls was a moral test for the wealthy nobles, many of whom fled while the poor were left behind. Yet Saladin and his brother Aladil personally paid the ransoms for thousands of the destitute, a gesture of profound mercy. On October the 2nd, the day of the Prophet's journey to heaven, the gates of Jerusalem opened. A somber procession of thousands left the city, carrying whatever they could save. The Exodus of 1187 was a scene of profound sorrow, mothers clutching children and priests carrying relics. As they marched toward the coast, they were replaced by a new tide of Muslim pilgrims. The kingdom of heaven had become a kingdom of exiles. Saladin's entry was a masterclass in political theater. He ordered the cleansing of the holy sites with rose water from Damascus. He allowed the Eastern Orthodox to stay and the Jews to return, positioning himself as the magnanimous conqueror of a multi-faith city. He understood that his legacy depended not on how many he killed, but on how he ruled. His victory solidified his status as a figure of chivalry, even to his enemies. When the news reached Europe, it was a catastrophe of biblical proportions. Legend says Pope Urban III died of a broken heart. The shock triggered a wave of hysteria and a renewed call for a crusade of kings. The Third Crusade, led by Richard the Lionheart, was born from the ashes of 1187. But the foundation of the Latin East had been permanently damaged. Jerusalem would remain a contested prize for centuries, a focal point for the clash of civilizations. Official history painted Balian as a tragic hero and Saladin as a noble adversary, but the cleanup of law often ignored the internal rot. The fall wasn't just a military defeat, it was a failure of the Crusader social contract. The friction between the old families and the new arrivals had hollowed out the kingdom. The skeletal remains of the Crusader dream were left to bleach in the sun as the world moved on to a new era of fragmented power. Modern forensic analysis shows where Saladin's sappers successfully undermined the fortifications. The forensic review reveals a siege of high technical complexity, where engineering was as important as the sword. Archaeologists have found evidence of intensive mining and counter-mining. The science validates that by the time Balian surrendered, the city's defenses were literally a hollow shell, waiting for the final collapse Saladin had engineered. The human toll was the total uprooting of a generation. Thousands of families were scattered across Europe, carrying the ghost of a city they could never return to. The dream of a permanent Christian East became a haunting memory, a moral mirror for the failure of the Crusader states. The psychological weight of losing the Holy Sepulchre would drive the next century of European politics, as kings struggled to explain how God could allow his city to fall. Hattin was the tactical error, Jerusalem was the strategic consequence. The final reckoning of 1187 is that zealotry is a poor substitute for logistics. The Crusaders lost because they failed to understand the land, while Saladin won because he turned geography and culture into his allies. The fall of the city marked the end of the first great chapter of the Crusades, leaving a scar on the history of the Middle East that remains sensitive to this day. As we look at the Golden Dome today, we see the echoes of the 1187 siege. If you were Balian, would you have threatened to destroy the holy sites to save your people? Or if you were Saladin, would you have granted mercy to a city that had shown none to yours? The fall of Jerusalem is the ultimate moral mirror. It asks us what we are willing to sacrifice for our beliefs and what we are willing to forgive for the sake of peace.